They told him he couldn't sit at the table. They were right. He didn't come to sit. He came to own the room. On the last Friday of October, inside a private dining room at the Sterling Room, in Chicago's financial district, a group of men in expensive suits were quietly deciding the fate of 600 people who would never be invited into a place like this. Crystal glasses caught the light. Piano music drifted from the main floor. The air smelled of aged wine and leather-bound menus, and at the corner table, behind a curtain of wine-red velvet, Preston Vale was about to close the most profitable deal of his career. He just didn't know that the man refilling his glass had already made it impossible. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, because this story is for anyone who has ever been looked through like they weren't standing right there. Julian Carter was 45 years old, and carried himself like a man who had long stopped needing other people's approval. His hair was salted at the temples, his hands were steady, and his shoes, black leather, old but polished to a mirror finish, made almost no sound on the hardwood floor of the Sterling Room's main corridor. He wore the uniform of a server, white shirt, black vest, black apron folded at the waist. He carried a tray. He moved through the room the way he always had in this building, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that invisibility, in the right circumstances, was a kind of power. The Sterling Room was where Julian Carter had learned that. He was 17 years old, the first time he walked through the service entrance on Wabash Avenue. His mother had arranged it through a woman at their church who knew the kitchen supervisor. Julian had shown up in the only dress shirt he owned, ironed by hand, and been assigned to the back of the house, the industrial sink, the prep station, the stacked towers of dishes that never seemed to diminish no matter how fast he worked. He spent 2 years in that kitchen before Thomas Bell, the floor manager, let him carry a tray into the dining room. By then, Julian had already learned the lesson that would stay with him longer than anything he studied afterward. Wealthy people spoke freely in front of servers. Not because they were careless, because they had decided, somewhere deep in the architecture of their worldview, that the people carrying their food did not fully exist. He filed that away, and he never forgot it. Preston Vale occupied the corner booth with the velvet curtain, because he had specifically requested it. 48 hours earlier, his assistant had called the Sterling Room and asked for the most private arrangement available for a party of 6. Thomas Bell had accommodated the request, without asking what the meeting was about. That was the nature of this establishment. You did not ask what wealthy men discussed over $400 bottles of wine. You simply made sure the glasses were never empty. Preston was 51, trim in a charcoal suit, with the kind of even-toned authority that came not from intelligence, but from having never been seriously challenged. He had been installed as acting CEO of Northline Foods 8 months earlier by a consortium of private equity investors who had acquired the company's debt at a discount and now needed someone to orchestrate what they called a strategic transition. In plain language, sell the valuable parts, shed the obligations, and collect a performance bonus before the carcass hit the ground. Northline Foods had been a Southside institution for 43 years. It employed 600 people across 2 facilities, most of them from neighborhoods within a few miles of the original plant. It made packaged bread products, dry goods, and frozen prepared foods under 3 regional labels that grocery chains across the Midwest had stocked for decades. It had weathered recessions and consolidations and 2 ownership changes. It had survived because the people on its production lines showed up before sunrise and stayed until the work was done, and because the company, for most of its history, had honored its side of that arrangement. That arrangement was what Preston Vale intended to dissolve. Seated around the curtain table with him were Celeste Monroe, his communications director, whose job was to make whatever happened next sound like a gift to the community. Grant Holloway, the CFO, who had spent the last 6 months restructuring Northline's internal ledgers in ways that would take a forensic accountant to fully untangle, and 3 outside investors whose Names appeared on no public documents, but whose money had quietly accumulated a controlling interest in Northline's debt instruments. The plan they were finalizing tonight had 4 steps. Transfer the 3 most profitable brand licenses to a new holding company. Leave the legacy obligations, the old plant, the pension liability, the long-tenured workforce, inside the original entity. Declare the original entity insolvent. Collect the performance incentives before the trustees arrived. The pension freeze was the piece that required the most delicate handling. Grant had buried it in a supplemental amendment attached to the asset transfer agreement. The language was technical and deliberate. The effect was simple. Once the assets moved, the 600 people who had spent their careers at Northline would find their retirement accounts locked behind a legal wall that would take years to challenge, and cost more than most of them had to fight. Julian stood at the edge of the velvet curtain and poured burgundy into Preston Vale's glass. Preston did not look at him. He raised the glass slightly, a reflex of entitlement, and continued his sentence. One of the investors had asked about union response. Preston smiled with the ease of a man who had made this calculation many times. "Those people are exhausted," he said. "You give them a few weeks of severance and a well-produced video about transformation, and most of them will sign whatever you put in front of them. The ones who don't have lawyers they can't afford to pay." Celeste nodded, tapping something into her phone with one manicured finger. "We've already drafted the public announcement. We're calling it a compassionate restructuring. We have testimonials lined up from 2 former employees who are, let's say, financially cooperative." One of the investors chuckled. Another lifted his glass. Julian refilled the glass nearest to him. His hand was perfectly still, his face showed nothing. But behind his eyes, behind the practiced blankness that years of learning this room had given him, something moved. Not anger exactly. Something older and quieter than anger. Something that had been waiting a long time for exactly this night. A drop of wine fell from the bottle's lip and landed on the edge of a folder at the corner of the table. Julian reached for his cloth napkin, as any server would, and leaned slightly forward to blot the stain before it spread. As the white cloth touched the paper, his eyes moved across the top sheet. Not searching, just present, the way eyes are when they have been trained to see. 3 words in blue ink, handwritten in the margin of the supplemental amendment. Pension freeze after. That was all he needed to read. He already knew what came after. Preston noticed the pause. Just a half second, just a slight interruption in the rhythm of the room. But Preston Vale was a man who paid attention to disruptions. "Is there something interesting on that page?" Julian straightened. "I apologize, sir, I was blotting the wine." Preston's eyes dropped to the folder, then came back up slowly. He looked at Julian the way people like Preston Vale look at people like Julian Carter. Not with hostility exactly, but with the total absence of consideration that was somehow worse. "This isn't a reading room," Preston said, "and this isn't a table for the staff." There was a brief silence. One of the investors shifted. Celeste set her phone down. Julian took a step back. "Of course, sir." But Preston wasn't finished. He had an audience, and he understood the value of small demonstrations. "In fact," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest occupied tables beyond the curtain, "why don't you stay on your side of the room? These are private documents. The people at this table paid for their seats." One of the investors laughed softly. Another smiled at his wine. Julian looked at Preston for a moment, just a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his vest and set something on the edge of the tray. A small metal name badge, the paint worn thin at the edges, the clip on the back bent from years of use. The name on it read, Jules. Preston glanced at it the way he might glance at a paperclip. "Jules," he said, reading it with the particular tone of a man discovering something quaint. "Well, Jules, what do you think this company is worth?" He meant it as a dismissal dressed up as a question. He expected silence, or an apology, or the small performance of a man trying to recover his dignity without success. Julian looked at the folder. "More than the people at this table are willing to pay for it," he said. The curtain moved slightly. From the main floor, The piano played on. Preston set his glass down. Thomas Bell appeared at the edge of the curtain, having materialized the way floor managers do when they sense a problem forming. He caught Julian's eye and gave the slight nod that meant, "Come with me now," quietly. Julian followed him to the corridor beside the kitchen. Thomas spoke in a low voice, his hand on Julian's arm. "I don't know what's happening in there, but those are very important clients, and I need this evening to go smoothly. Whatever he said to you, and I know how he said it, I need you to go back in there and apologize. One sentence. That's all." Julian looked at Thomas Bell. He had known this man for nearly 3 decades. He had watched Thomas navigate this building with the careful precision of a man who had learned that survival in certain spaces required a kind of permanent deference. He did not resent Thomas for it. He understood it. He had done it himself for years, in rooms that required it. "Tom, Julian's, do you know what they're planning to do with Northline Foods?" Thomas was quiet. "Your brother worked there," Julian said. "Line supervisor, second shift, 12 years. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Julian, I know, I'll handle it." Julian turned back toward the curtain, "But I'm not apologizing." He walked back into the private dining room and took up his position near the service cart. Preston had resumed his conversation. The supplemental amendment was open on the table. Grant Holloway had produced a pen. Julian watched Grant's hand hover over the signature line. Then he excused himself to the kitchen. In the narrow hallway between the walk-in refrigerator and the prep station, Julian took out his phone and called a number he had called only once that morning, right after leaving the offices of Northline's largest institutional shareholder. "Rebecca, I saw your message," said the woman on the other end. Her voice was precise, uncluttered, the voice of someone who spent her days handling things that could not afford ambiguity. "Are you ready?" Julian looked through the small porthole window in the kitchen door. He could see Grant Holloway capping his pen. The amendment, he thought, was signed. "Give them 5 more minutes," Julian said. "Then come in." He hung up. A hand touched his elbow gently. It was Maria Valdez, who had been a server at the Sterling Room for 31 years, 12 of them longer than Julian had worked here in his youth. She was in her 60s now, still sharp-eyed, still carrying herself with the particular dignity of a woman who had served 10,000 meals and never forgotten a single person who had thanked her for it. "Still Jules," she said, looking at the badge on his tray. He almost smiled. "Still me." She glanced toward the velvet curtain. "Those men in there, I've seen their kind before. They always think we're furniture. They think we hear but can't act," Julian said. "That's different, and it's worse." Maria reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded square of paper. "My brother Victor worked at Northline for 19 years. He has something in a filing cabinet at home. A letter from the original ownership, signed promises about the pension. He's kept it because he didn't know if it mattered." She pressed the paper into Julian's hand. "I think maybe it matters now." Julian held the paper for a moment without opening it. Then he folded it and placed it in his vest pocket beside the old name badge. "Thank you, Maria." She went back to the main floor without another word. Julian stood in the corridor and thought about his father. Not for the first time that evening, and not for the last. Samuel Carter had worked at the Northline Foods plant on Halsted Street for 31 years. He had started on the loading dock when he was 23, moved to the packaging line, eventually became a line inspector trusted to train new hires. He was the kind of man who brought a steel lunchbox and knew everyone's name. He organized the holiday food drives for the plant. He stayed late when the machinery broke down and nobody asked him to, because he believed, genuinely, without irony, that the place where you worked was worth taking care of. He raised Julian largely alone after Julian's mother passed when Julian was 11. He worked double shifts to keep the lights on. He read the union bulletin every month the way other men read the sports page. He believed in the company. He told Julian, more than once, in different words that always meant the same thing. A company is not a building. It is the people who walk into it before the sun comes up. Julian grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on 63rd Street, 3 blocks from the elevated train and 7 blocks from the Northline plant. He could hear the plant's morning shift whistle from his bedroom window on quiet mornings. His father was always gone before that whistle sounded. Julian would wake sometimes at 5 and find the kitchen smelling of coffee that had already been drunk, and a plate of food left covered on the stove, scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes a piece of fruit. Samuel Carter believed strongly in feeding his son a warm breakfast, even when he would not be there to eat it with him. Julian spent his school years in the company of books and ambition, 2 things his neighborhood gave him little infrastructure to support, but which Samuel encouraged with the particular insistence of his peers, who understood that his own ceiling was low and wanted something different for his child. He pushed Julian toward the library, toward the after-school programs, toward every scholarship application he could find, not because he was ashamed of what he did for a living, but because he understood that the world his son would have to navigate rewarded certain credentials, and he wanted his son to have them. What Samuel could not anticipate was that Julian would also inherit his father's instinct for the people standing behind the credential, that the finance degree would sit alongside a memory of steel lunchboxes and double shifts, that the MBA would never fully displace the years he had spent in this building, watching. When the first private equity group acquired Northline's debt, 14 years before the present night, they installed an interim management team that moved quickly. The pension contributions were temporarily deferred, while the company realigned its cost structure. The deferral became permanent. Long-tenured workers who reached retirement age found their expected benefits had been recalculated using new formulas that nobody had clearly explained. Samuel Carter retired at 62 because his knees gave out, not because his finances allowed it. His monthly check was less than half of what he had been told to expect. He had no savings to speak of. He died 3 years later, not from any single dramatic cause, but from the quiet erosion of a man whose life's work had been weighed and found inconvenient. Julian was 34 when his father died. He had, by then, finished a degree at University of Illinois, and an MBA he had paid for through a combination of night shift work and loans that took 9 years to retire. He had spent 6 years in corporate finance, learning from the inside how the numbers worked, how the frameworks operated, how deals that ruined lives were structured to appear, on paper, as sound business decisions. He was good at it. He was very good at it. But he was not there to be good at it for people like Preston Vale. Carter Renewal Group had started small. Julian, 2 analysts he trusted, and a financial model that looked for companies being intentionally mismanaged toward a predetermined failure. Companies where the asset stripping was disguised as restructuring, where the pension fraud was buried in supplemental amendments, where 600 lives were treated as legacy costs to be eliminated on a schedule. He bought his first company at 38. By 42, Carter Renewal Group had restored labor contracts at 3 facilities in the Midwest and returned $7 million in improperly withheld pension contributions to their rightful owners. He did not do press interviews. He did not attend galas. He did not appear on any list of wealthy philanthropists. He simply did the work. He had been watching Northline for 2 years. When Preston Vale's consortium acquired the debt and installed their man, Julian began the process. It took 14 months, and the cooperation of 4 institutional shareholders who, when presented with a competing offer that was legally cleaner and structurally sounder, chose the less complicated transaction. The acquisition closed at 9:12 that morning, in a conference room, 12 blocks from where Julian now stood in a server's apron, pouring wine for the man who had not yet realized the company he was selling no longer belonged to him. Julian walked back into the private dining room. Grant Holloway was stacking the signed papers into a leather portfolio. Celeste was writing something on her phone. One of the investors was consulting his watch. Preston Vale had his hand around his wineglass and the look of a man who had already moved on to thinking about dinner. "Jules," Preston said without looking up. "Another round." Julian filled the glass. Then the next. Then he set the bottle on the service cart and straightened his vest. Preston looked up then, perhaps sensing something in the stillness. "You still here?" "I am," Julian said. "We're about to take a photograph," Celeste said, looking up from her phone with the practiced warmth of a woman who had made a career out of making things look better than they were. "Something candid. Local atmosphere." She gestured toward Julian with a small circling motion of her hand, the way you would gesture at furniture you wanted repositioned. "You standing there with the bottle. It's very authentic." Julian did not move. Preston leaned back, amused now in the way powerful men become amused when they sense they are about to win a small interaction. "Come on, Jules. Stand behind the table. Look like you work here." "I did work here," Julian said. 26 years ago. I was 17. I washed dishes in that kitchen until Thomas Bell let me carry a tray. I learned in this building that people like you say the most important things when you've decided the person standing in front of you isn't listening. He paused. "I've been listening all evening." The warmth left Preston's face. "What exactly do you think you've heard?" "A pension freeze written into a supplemental amendment, an asset transfer designed to move the value out and leave the liability behind. A communications plan that calls the destruction of 600 livelihoods a compassionate restructuring." Julian set the tray on the service cart, and a CFO who flinches when someone mentions a forensic audit. Grant Holloway's hand went still on the leather portfolio. Celeste's smile did not disappear, but something behind it did. Preston put his glass down with a deliberate click. "You need to leave this room," he said. "Right now. Before you say another word that gets you fired and possibly sued." "I'm not employed by the Sterling Room tonight," Julian said. "I asked Thomas for a favor. He gave me a shift." The velvet curtain moved. Rebecca Sloan walked in. She was 50, compact, dressed in a dark blazer, with a document case under one arm. Behind her came two legal assistants and a man in his 70s, wearing a canvas work jacket that had seen decades of use. His name was Henry Wallace, and he had spent 19 years as the elected labor representative for Northline Foods' production floor. He walked slowly, with the careful steps of a man whose knees had absorbed a lifetime of concrete floors, but his eyes were clear and level, and entirely unimpressed by the room he had just entered. Preston looked at Rebecca the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong place. "Who are you?" Rebecca set the document case on the corner of the table, unlatched it, and removed a gray envelope sealed with a red tab. "Rebecca Sloan, counsel for Carter Renewal Group." She slid the envelope across table toward the center. "As of 9/12 this morning, Carter Renewal Group holds 54% of the voting shares of Northline Foods, acquired through a direct purchase agreement with the primary institutional holders of record. The transaction was notarized, filed with the Illinois Secretary of State's office, and transmitted to Northline's registered legal counsel before 10 a.m. No one spoke. One of the investors picked up his water glass and then set it back down. Preston said, "That's not possible. We were in the middle of an asset transfer." "You were in the middle of an asset transfer that your company no longer had the authority to execute," Rebecca said. "The transfer agreement was initiated under the authority of the acting CEO. As of this morning, that authority belongs to the new controlling shareholder." Grant Holloway had turned the color of the tablecloth. Preston pushed back from the table and stood. "I want my attorneys on the phone in the next 60 seconds. "That's your right," Rebecca said. She was already opening the document case and removing a series of tabbed folders. "In the meantime, these are the materials Carter Renewal Group will be submitting to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation regarding the pension fund irregularities. This one," she placed a folder in front of Grant, "details the transfers from Northline's pension reserve into a consulting contract held by a company registered in your spouse's name, Mr. Holloway. This one," another folder, slid to the center of the table, "is the supplemental amendment you signed this evening, which, under the new ownership structure, constitutes an unauthorized attempt to encumber employee benefit obligations. And this," she set a third folder near Celeste, is the draft press release describing mass layoffs as a compassionate restructuring. For the record. Celeste put her phone face down on the table. Preston stood with his hand on the back of his chair. His voice, when it came, had lost its evenness. You think you can walk in here with a folder and undo a 6-month transaction? Julian, who had been standing near the service cart and had not moved, spoke. The transaction was never valid, he said. You were selling a company that the majority shareholders had already agreed to transfer. The lawyers can sort out the technical sequence. But the pension freeze doesn't happen. The asset stripping doesn't happen. And the 600 people you plan to walk away from are going to have someone in that building who doesn't treat them as a line item. Preston looked at him. In Preston's expression, Julian could see the specific confusion of a man whose mental model of the world did not have a place for what was happening. He had looked at Julian and seen a server. That was not a mistake born of inattention. It was a mistake born of a very confident and very particular way of seeing the world, one in which a black man in a white vest carrying a tray occupied a fixed position in a fixed hierarchy, and in which that position made him safe to ignore. You, Preston said. You're Carter Renewal Group. Julian reached into his vest pocket and set the old name badge on the table beside Rebecca's documents. Julian Carter, he said, Chairman, Carter Renewal Group, and as of this morning, your employer. He let a beat pass, though that arrangement will be short-lived. Henry Wallace had been standing near the curtain the whole time. He stepped forward now and set something on the table that he had been carrying inside his jacket, a folded letter, worn soft at the creases from years of careful storage. He smoothed it flat on the tablecloth. This is the original pension commitment letter, Henry said, signed by the board of directors in the company's 22nd year of operation. Before any of you people got near it. His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something in a room where people were required to listen. We were told this was a family. We were told the company would never walk away from us. We kept our end. We want what was promised. One of the investors looked at the letter. Then he looked at the folder Rebecca had placed in front of him. Then he quietly closed the unsigned copies of the asset transfer agreement and stacked them to one side. I'm not putting my name on anything that's going to a regulatory review, he said. The second investor, without a word, stood and retrieved his coat from the back of his chair. Grant Holloway was looking at the door. Mr. Holloway, Rebecca said, in the tone of someone addressing a fact rather than a person, we've asked the firm's security to ensure the integrity of the financial documents on the premises. You're welcome to remain or to leave, but the materials stay. Thomas Bell had appeared in the gap of the curtain. He looked at the table, at Julian, at the folder in front of Grant, at Henry Wallace, standing with his hands folded in front of him, and then at Preston Vale, who was still standing with his hand on the back of his chair, the architecture of his certainty visibly failing around him. Thomas said nothing for a moment, then he looked at Preston. The evening is concluded, sir. Preston looked at him with the automatic authority of a man accustomed to compliance. Thomas held his gaze, and Thomas Bell, who had spent 30 years learning to manage difficult guests in the delicate language of hospitality, who had spent that same 30 years perfecting the art of deference to the kind of power that walked through his front door in custom suits, did not look away. Preston picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and walked out. Celeste followed. Grant gathered the leather portfolio and was met at the curtain by one of Rebecca's assistants who asked him to leave the documents behind. The investors filed out without speaking. The room was quiet. Henry Wallace sat down in the chair nearest to him. Not Preston's chair, but the one beside it. He sat the way old men sit when they have been on their feet longer than their bodies want them to be, and he looked around the room at the crystal and the white linen and the half-full glasses of expensive wine, and he said, very quietly, Samuel would have liked to see this. Julian was standing near the service cart. He did not move right away. He looked at the folder with his father's pension commitment letter in it, and at the old name badge on the table, and at Henry Wallace, sitting in the good chair, in the good room, and he thought about a steel lunchbox, and a double shift, and a man who believed the place you worked was worth taking care of. He knew, Julian said. He always said the company was the people who walked in before sunrise. He just never got a chance to prove it. Preston walked out of the Sterling room without speaking again. Julian watched him go and felt nothing dramatic, no surge of satisfaction, no desire to call after him. That surprised him sometimes, the absence of the emotion he had imagined when he had first begun to plan this. He had thought there would be something that felt like victory. What he felt instead was closer to completion, like setting down something very heavy at the exact point where you intended to set it down, and being grateful that your arms had held. The room settled. Rebecca and her assistants worked methodically through the materials on the table, inventorying, sequencing, timestamping. Henry Wallace sat with his hands folded and watched them work with the quiet attention of a man who has learned not to celebrate until the paper is filed and the door is locked. Thomas Bell lingered near the curtain. At one point, he came to stand beside Julian. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said. "Earlier tonight, I asked you to say sorry to a man who—" "You were doing your job," Julian said. "I know what this place cost you. It shouldn't cost that much." Julian looked at the room, the half-full glasses, the abandoned folders, the chair where Preston Vale had sat with all his confidence arranged around him like furniture. "No," he said, "it shouldn't." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have liked this." It was the second time someone had said that tonight. Julian thought it was probably true, but he also thought that his father, characteristically, would have been more interested in what happened next than in what had just happened. Samuel Carter was not a man who spent time in the pleasures of retrospect. He was a man who showed up to the next shift. The news moved quickly through Northline's internal channels that night. By 11 o'clock, Preston Vale had received formal notification that his authority as acting CEO had been revoked pending the ownership transition review. By midnight, Grant Holloway's legal team had been contacted by the regulatory office regarding document preservation requirements. Celeste Monroe's communications contract with Northline was rendered void by a clause that prohibited misrepresentation of material facts to the public. The press release about the compassionate restructuring was never sent. 3 days later, Carter Renewal Group issued a formal statement to the Northline workforce. It was not a press release, it was a letter. 2 pages, single-spaced, addressed to every employee by name and years of service, printed on paper, and slipped into the payroll envelopes on the next distribution day. It said, among other things, that the pending asset transfer had been halted, that the pension review was underway, and that no production facility would close without a workforce transition plan agreed upon by an employee oversight council. It said that the company's first obligation was to the people who had built it, and that profit was not a reason to abandon that obligation, only a measure of whether the obligation was being honored. Julian did not sign it as chairman. He signed it as the son of Samuel Carter, who worked at this plant from 1979 to 2010. 2 months later, at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in December, Julian stood inside the main production floor of Northline's South Side facility. The machinery was running. The overhead lights hummed. The smell was exactly what Henry Wallace had predicted when they had first spoken about the building. Yeast and warm packaging, and something underneath it, like flour and machine oil, that could only be described as the smell of work being done. On the east wall, where the shift schedule had hung for 4 decades, a new sign had been mounted. Dark wood, brass letters. It read, Samuel Carter Worker Hall. Beneath the name, in smaller letters, a company is not a building. It is the people who walk in before sunrise. A small gathering of workers stood below it. Not a ceremony exactly. Julian had been clear about that. No speeches, no cameras, no catered reception. Just the people who worked here, standing in the place where they worked, looking at a name on a wall. Some of them had known Samuel Carter. Ellen Price had trained under him on the packaging line, 1993. She stood with her arms crossed and her chin up, the way she had always stood when something moved her, and she didn't want anyone to see how much. A younger woman beside her, maybe 30, who had started at Northline 4 years ago and had never met Samuel Carter, was reading the words beneath the name slowly, her lips moving. When she finished, she looked at Julian and said, very simply, "That's right," and went back to her station, because the work was still going. Henry Wallace stood nearest to the sign. He pressed his palm against the wood, the way you touch something you have waited a long time to be allowed to touch. "We used to eat lunch in here," he said, "before they converted this section to storage. Sam would bring extra food. He always made too much on purpose." Henry's voice did not waver, but his hand stayed flat against the wood. He said he never wanted somebody to sit alone at lunch because they couldn't afford to eat. Julian stood a few steps back. He held the old name badge in his closed hand, the one that read Jules, the one he had carried since the night he cleared his locker at the Sterling Room at 19 years old, and saved the badge because it was the first softness that he had ever existed in a room where most people assumed he didn't. That evening, 3 weeks before Christmas, the Sterling Room hosted a private dinner for 40 guests. The reservation was not in Preston Vale's name. It was not in the name of any consortium or equity group or holding company. It was in Julian Carter's name, and the 40 guests were retired workers from Northline Foods, men and women who had spent between 12 and 38 years on the production floor, most of whom had never eaten at a restaurant with a velvet curtain before, and all of whom had received a handwritten invitation that said only, "You built something worth saving. Come and let someone take care of you for a night." Julian did not sit at the head of any table. He moved through the room in a white shirt, carrying a water pitcher, filling glasses, asking people about their grandchildren and their aches and their gardens, listening the way he had learned to listen in this building a very long time ago. Thomas Bell appeared at his elbow at one point in the evening. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said. Julian refilled a glass for a woman named Ellen Price, who had worked on Northline's second production line for 23 years, and who laughed at something her neighbor said, with the kind of uncomplicated happiness that comes from feeling, for one evening, fully visible. "I know," Julian said, "that's the point." On each table there was a small card, not a menu, a card with a person's name and a number, the years they had given. Henry Wallace, 19 years. Maria Valdez, brother Victor, 19 years. Ellen Price, 23 years. And on, 40 names, 40 numbers, the arithmetic of a life's work finally made visible in a room that had spent most of its history making such people invisible. At the end of the evening, Julian stood near the service station and reached into his pocket. He set the old badge on the clean white cloth of the side table, next to the worn notebook he had brought in his jacket. His father's notebook, 31 years of daily entries, the names of people trained, the equipment repaired, the promises made, and the promises that had not been kept by people who were no longer in a position to keep them. He did not open the notebook. He did not need to. He had read it enough times to carry it inside him. In the way you carry things that have become part of the structure of who you are. He thought about what his father had said once, standing at their kitchen table after a long shift when Julian was 13, and had asked him why he kept going back to a place that didn't pay enough and didn't say thank you. Samuel Carter had looked at him the way fathers look at children when they are about to say something they will need the child to remember. "Because the other people there still have to go back," he said. "And it matters whether there's someone there who treats the work like it's worth doing." Julian had not understood it then, not completely. He understood it now in his whole body. The way you eventually understand the things your parents tried to give you before you were old enough to receive them. Preston Vale had come to the Sterling Room that Friday evening to sell a company. He had believed in the specific and well-practiced confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a room that mattered, that the transaction would be simple, that the people it affected were too tired and too poor and too distant from the corridors of power to stop anything. that the man refilling his glass was furniture. He had looked at Julian Carter and seen a waiter. The failure was not cruelty. Exactly. It was something more systemic and more instructive than cruelty. It was the absolute assumption that the person carrying your glass could not possibly be the person who held your future. In a document filed before 10 o'clock that morning, it was the logic of a world that had been arranged to tell certain people that they did not belong in certain rooms, and had told them so often and so firmly that people like Preston Vale had stopped thinking of it as an assumption and started thinking of it as a fact. Julian had known that assumption all his life. He had worked inside it and around it and through it, from the kitchen at 17 to the conference room at 45, carrying it the way you carry knowledge that is useful precisely because the people who benefit from it have stopped seeing it as knowledge. He had not returned to the Sterling room that Friday to perform an education. He had returned because a man named Samuel Carter had once taught him that the work is not finished until the people who did it are treated like they matter. And because the only way Julian knew how to honor that was to walk back through a door that had once been the only door available to him, and to use everything the room had ever refused to see. There are people in every city in this country who walk into buildings before the sun comes up. They know the machinery by sound. They know their co-workers by the particular way. Each of them moves at the end of a long shift. They have made the same commitment every day that companies promise to honor, and too often do not. Their names are in notebooks. Their years are in filing cabinets. Their futures depend on the integrity of people they will never share a meal with. What Julian Carter understood, and what the velvet curtain in the private dining room had never been able to change, was that value and visibility are not the same thing. That the person carrying the tray has seen more of the room than the person sitting at the table. And that the most important question in any negotiation is not who is holding the pen, but who built the table in the first place. He picked up the old name badge one last time, turned it over in his palm, and set it back down beside his father's notebook on the clean white cloth. Jules. The boy who washed dishes, the man who came back. Both of them had been in the room all along.